My name is David Hunt. I'm the School Improvement and State and Federal Programs Consultant for the Muskegon Area Intermediate School District. One of my responsibilities is to work with districts to understand their Title I allocation. This has been a topic of heightened interest now that the federal COVID relief funds are being distributed to districts based on the federal Title I allocation formula. The districts that I work with noticed right away that there was a significant disparity in how much funds districts were receiving, even if they had similar characteristics. Please understand that I'm not trying to convey that any districts or students are not deserving of any of the funding that they received or may receive. I only hope to show in two examples that using the Title I allocation formula for a purpose it was not intended is having significant unintended funding outcomes. These two examples that I'm going to share are not unique. They're representative of the larger systemic issue. So our first example is about two districts in the same ISD that share a border and are the same size. So in our total count, we can see that they're within just a few hundred students of each other. But the Title I allocation uses different numbers than their total count that we use in Michigan. These two columns, columns C and D, are calculated from the US Census Bureau and interpreted by the US Department of Education. And they use an algorithm to come up with these numbers, and those numbers are updated on a yearly basis and are used to calculate our Title I funds. I have a whole video that's just 6 minutes long that really goes into detail about the Title I allocation that I will link in this video. The main thing that of concern here is that if you have districts that have stable enrollment, such as our first example, Mona Shores, we can see our total count of almost 4,000 students is pretty close to what the Census Bureau would say is their total population. But if you look at larger districts or districts that used to be larger and now have declining enrollment, they fall into a hold harmless situation where their enrollment can only decline by about 5% per year. And so you start to get very large disparities between what the federal government is using for their total population count and the actual amount of students in the district. So in our case here, you can see our second example, Muskegon Public Schools has an actual count of around 3,600 students, but for the federal calculation, it's estimated by the federal government that they have over 6,000 students. So it is because of this disparity and the situation with hold harmless that we end up with very large disparities in funding. So here we have our district, they share a border, they're in the same ISD, they're the same size with about the same amount of students. The significant difference here is that one district has about twice the amount of economically disadvantaged students attending. And so we would for sure assume that that district would get more help, knowing that part of the ESSER funds are there to help with equity issues. What we see when we do some calculations on a per pupil basis is that our first example will be getting about $92 per student for Title I, and our second example will get $961 per student for Title I, and which is about 10 times the amount of Mona Shores. And since our ESSER funds are based off of our Title I allocation, we see that Muskegon Public will get 10 times the amount per pupil for ESSER funds as well as Mona Shores, even though they're the same size. Again, pointing out that the ESSER funds are definitely there to try to work on equity gaps, but in a district where there's maybe twice as many economically disadvantaged students with the same size, was it intended that there should be 10 times the allocation going to that district? Some may say yes, and that is definitely not a judgment call for me to make. But this is just an example, the first example when we have two districts, same area, same size. The other example that I have is about two districts that are in two different areas and are slightly different in size, but they have the same number of economically disadvantaged students, or I should say the same percentage of economically disadvantaged students. So here we have Godwin Heights with a total student count of a little over 2,000 students, And we have Flint with a total count of a little over 3,700 students, and they have very similar amount of economically disadvantaged students. Here's where we see an even bigger situation with the hold harmless. So Flint used to be a very large school district with a large enrollment and had seen significant declines in student enrollment, but they were held harmless and could only lose 5% of those numbers per year in this calculation. And so many years down the road, they have about 3,700 students in the district, but the federal government, using the census counts, estimates that they have 16,000 students in the district. Godwin Heights, a district with stable enrollment, has a much closer number between what the federal government says in the census count versus their actual total counts. And so here we have two districts with the same or extremely similar economically disadvantaged numbers, but the larger district, according to the Census Bureau, is getting 12 times the amount of Title I allocation and 13 times the ESSER allocation. And so if we go back to one of the stated purposes of equity, it's a very inequitable situation to have districts that have similar characteristics of students, but one district getting 13 times the allocation as another district. I hope that these two examples shed some light on the funding disparities that exist across the state when we're using the Title I allocation formula to distribute the ESSER funds to districts.